A recent study shows that 1 in 10 Australians are racial supremacists. Kevin Dunn, Professor of Human Geography and Urban Studies at the University of Western Sydney, led a team of researchers to study the geography of racism in Australia.
We've been able to establish empirically that there is a recognisable problem of racism in Australia. Since 2001, we've commissioned telephone surveys of attitudes across Australia. But in 2006, we commissioned a nationwide survey which was specifically on the topic of the experience of racism.
The study collected a database on racist attitudes in Australia using a telephone survey of over 5,000 people from a broad section of the community. Some of the questions that the survey asked are: is it a good thing for a society to be made up of people from different cultures? And how concerned would you feel if one of your close relatives were to marry a person of a different background?
We use racism as a broad category, and we've asked lots of different questions in the surveys. Questions about racial supremacy. Now that is now a narrow number of people, only about 1 in 10 in Australia. But on the other types of questions, well, you get a larger number of people who would be categorised as being intolerant.
The study revealed that the group of people that bear the brunt of most racism is the Muslim community.
So we asked people about their attitudes towards other ethnic groups and how comfortable they would be if a close relative were to marry someone from some of those groups. We asked about Muslim Australians, and we asked people's views on Indigenous Australians, groups that we might consider to be out-groups, who we know are groups that there's some intolerance towards. And on those figures, we do find that, about 45% of people in New South Wales, for instance, said they'd be concerned if a close relative were to marry someone of Islamic background. So that's a higher figure. Over recent times, there has been an accumulation of Islamophobia in the West, which is interesting in a country like Australia, because the traditional understanding is when we have new migrant groups, that over a period of time, everyone becomes much more comfortable with their presence.
Since releasing the findings of the study publicly, Professor Dunn has been speaking at public forums such as the 4Rs conference about how to deal with the issue of racism in Australia in a practical sense.
Everyday racism needs everyday anti-racism. Methods to empower individuals, I'm thinking of. Principally, perhaps, rhetorical strategies and discursive materials, things that can be used by those who experience racism in their confrontations with the racist event.
I spoke to Hanifa Dean, author of the Jihad seminar, who was also present at the conference.
People are exposed to the media, and the media has been very, very anti-Muslim, particularly television. And because of these images of women in hijab and men with beards and so on, that becomes the international terrorist image. So that is perpetuated.
I've been reflecting recently on what could be done, what should be done about the poor image of Islam in Australia amongst ordinary Australians. And one of the things which is important to do, I think, is to remind Australians of the historical presence of Islam in Australia.
Muslims have been coming to Australia for a lot longer than white people have been here. And in fact, there are early records, Chinese records, of Chinese Muslim captains skirting the northern part of Australia, probably in the 1500s, 1600s. And in fact, we know that the interaction between Muslims and Indigenous people has happened at least since the 16th century.
Before white men came to Australia, the Muslims came but never took ownership of the land because it had its people in the same way that the Palestinian issue is, So there's a lot of commonalities that we have as Muslims and the owners of this land, the Indigenous people of Australia.
Up to 3/4 of Indigenous people are regularly experiencing racism in their everyday lives, the kind of racial slurs, the denial of service, the kind of views of you don't belong. Amazingly, in Kevin's surveys, you have people saying, which groups don't you think belong in Australia, and they identify Indigenous people. It's crazy.
Some people, especially in the Muslim community, have not been all that surprised by the findings of the study. I spoke to Dr. Parisa Asfadi, who migrated here from Iran 20 years ago, about the experience of migrants and Muslims in Sydney and what her thoughts were on the findings of Professor Dunn's study.
Well, I had two things to say about this. First is that, if you've lived here in this country as a migrant, you have experienced racism. particularly if you have darker skin and darker hair. You will definitely experience it. So there is no need for a study, indeed, to tell you that racism exists here. This place was supposed to be made in the image of English Europe. There was significant effort to actually restrict the people who came here so that that is maintained. To not go with the simplistic view that these Western societies are free of problems and they are successful models. A close encounter with it would tell anybody that that is not the case. Serious problems exist here.
Everything that the Australian government has been promoting, the leadership in government has really lacked the promoting harmony in the community. Instead of coming out loudly and speaking about some of those issues that were harming the minority, which is it was the Indigenous communities in Australia, as well as the Muslim community, as well as other minorities in Australia. It was just like ignore, it'll go away.
Muslims, as I said, have been here for a very long time and lead very vibrant lives and are in all aspects of society. But they still suffer from discrimination, and most of the discrimination that they face is both a combination of racial and religious discrimination. It's something that we call ethno-religious discrimination. And this is something that needs to be seriously looked at by government agencies to see how we can protect the rights of individuals, all individuals, including Muslim individuals.
The instances of everyday racism that we see in Sydney, for instance, name-calling, abuse, more threatening behaviour even, they are fundamentally linked to national images about Australia. They are fundamentally linked to what our leaders say. So if we've got leaders who are making disparaging comments about Islam, it fortifies that sort of activity in the street, in the everyday. If we have leaders who talk about, who cast an opprobrium over that sort of activity, and who have an expansive view and a welcoming view to different cultures and different faiths, then that disempowers everyday racism. No doubt about it.
While some people are surprised by the results of Kevin Dunn's recent study, others believe it reveals nothing new. Whether or not the study breaks new ground, it has certainly opened up discussion about the race issue, which is becoming increasingly important in Australia. Rahab Sharita for Press TV, Sydney.